The Tom Woods Show, episode 980.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Folks, we are coming down to the wire on the libertarian event of the year, the Contra Cruise. Join Bob Murphy and me for a week at sea that you will never forget. Hilarity and fun and lots of libertarian friends. Also, special guests Scott Horton, Dave Smith, and Michael Bolden. It is going to be a ton of fun. Join us at ContraCruise.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. I'm so glad Peter Van Buren is back with us. We had such a great conversation not too long ago when he was on to talk about his quite extraordinary and wonderfully well-written book, We Meant Well, How I Helped Lose the Battle for the Hearts and Minds of the Iraqi People. Well, he is back with a brand new book called Hooper's War, a novel of World War II Japan. Peter Van Buren is a former United States Foreign Service employee who spent a year in Iraq serving as team leader for 2 provincial reconstruction teams. He's a 24-year veteran of the U.S. Department of State, and he writes about Iraq and the Middle East at his blog, We Meant Well. And there's an interesting notice there, at least as of this recording in August 2017, over at wemeantwell.com. Peter, welcome back to the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me back again, Tom.
Everybody just loved having you. I wish you could come out with a book every week and we could just keep bringing you on. But Hooper's War. Now, first of all, I've done a couple of episodes, I think, with a work of fiction. And the tricky thing about talking about it is you want to get to the heart of it without any spoilers.
Sure.
So we're going to do our best to navigate this. And let's start off with you telling us about what the setting is and how... Well, again, even that. Well, the setting you can talk about. I was going to say how it opens, but
sure.
I kind of don't want to give away how it opens. But the way it opens is kind of the reverse of what you would expect. Anyway, you take what I just tried to ask and make something out of it. All right.
I've written a new book called Hooper's War, and it is, as you pointed out, fictional. It's a novel, but it is a novel that tries to talk about some very real events in the world, both historical and present day, using fiction as kind of a tool to do that. The basic theme is that it is an anti-war book, and in particular, it looks at the question of moral injury in war. And I'll circle back and define that more for folks in just a moment. But the very basics, I think, make it an interesting read, whether you're focused on the topic of moral injury or not. It's basically set in a slightly altered timeline of World War II, where, for reasons not particularly discussed, the atomic bombs just didn't work. And the United States had to go through and invade Japan in order to end World War II. And the story follows a young soldier named Nate Hooper, hence the title Hooper's War, through his interaction with both his own men, he's a young officer, with a Japanese soldier that he ends up tangled up with, and that's a big part of the story, we don't want to give too much away, and a Japanese woman, a civilian, who both he and the Japanese soldier end up involved with. It's not quite a love triangle, but the three of them play different roles in talking about what happens to people in war. Most of it is very serious. There are parts of it that are kind of funny. You'd want to think about movies like Best Years of Our Lives from the World War II, or Oliver Stone's movie Platoon, or from the Vietnam era, books like The Things They Carried, with a little bit of Catch-22 leavened in there. The character of Hooper appears in 2 forms. He appears as the narrator, as the 18-year-old young lieutenant stuck in the middle of this terrible, terrible war in Japan. And then he appears as a very old man at the end of his life looking back. And so the events of the story are actually told from multiple points of view. The Japanese soldier narrates at times, the woman narrates at times, Hooper as an old man, Hooper as a young man. And each of these people gives us a different perspective on some of these same issues, but at the end of the day, it boils down to talking about this concept of moral injury.
And what I find interesting about this whole project of yours is that thinking about moral injury, which we'll talk about in a minute, is the kind of thing we expect to see carried out, let's say, in a war story from the Vietnam War or from a deeply unpopular war where we envision soldiers having a great many moral conundrums to struggle with. But it's almost, I don't know, weirdly... when you're dealing with the good war, it's like it's weirdly iconoclastic of you to be putting it in that kind of setting. So why did you?
There's a couple of things. The main reason is exactly what you just touched on. We have certain tropes out there regarding our history. One of them is that World War II was the good war, Korea was sort of the neutral but forgotten war, Vietnam the bad war, and so forth. And those have been burned pretty deeply into our national consciousness and our psyche. But as I began to look into these ideas of what happens to people in war, we're familiar with this concept of PTSD, but less with moral injury. I found that they exist throughout history in war, that you can find references to the damage war does to people in these ways, using different words, but going all the way back to Thucydides and the early Greek historians. There's nothing particularly unique about them in Vietnam versus in World War II. And in exploring this book and talking to veterans from all sorts of wars. And I spoke with people who were in World War II, both in the United States and in Japan. I interviewed people from both angles. They all said remarkably similar things. And the stuff I heard from soldiers that I was embedded with in Iraq changed the language around a little bit, and it's the same thing I'm hearing from a 90-year-old guy over drinks at the VA hall, and the same thing I'm hearing from an elderly Japanese person in Tokyo. They're all saying similar things. And so I thought, by putting it into this setting of World War II, I'm going to first manipulate the reader. That's not the nice word to say, but I'm going to play on those tropes and challenge the reader to see this as universal, as generic, by purposely putting in a setting where the reader is going to start off, perhaps, I'll say, a little suspicious of me.
Well, I can certainly see the merit of your decision regarding the setting in the fact that you've got a case where a Japanese soldier observes a neighbor being killed by an errant American bomb just by accident, and the effect that has on him and how it changes him. It would be too obvious and too sledgehammer if that had been set in 2003 Baghdad, for example.
But yet it's the same process. The incident that we're referring to is what in modern language we call the moment of radicalization. The young Japanese boy in the story is sent off to the countryside to protect him from the war, which is a little known part of history, the mass migration of children out of Japanese cities. He's sent off to the countryside, and war is something that's far and distant to him. He has no real thoughts on this. He is radicalized, to use the modern term, when an errant bomb kills a neighbor that he was very fond of. It was an accident, clearly. Later in the story, however, what was an accidental civilian death is repeated on a mass scale when the United States unleashes a firebombing of a major Japanese city as part of the story. And my intention is to explain to modern readers, using a more neutral setting, we'll call it maybe, of Japan 70-some years ago, to explain the effect of blowing people up in terms of making enemies. I saw that myself in Iraq. Every bad guy that was hauled in by the U.S. troops had Abu Ghraib photos on his phone that he looked at for inspiration. And if you want to turn people against you, there's nothing that does that better than the killing of innocents. And whether you're talking about that on an individual scale, when you're talking about that on a national scale, or when the government of the United States blows up a hospital in Afghanistan or destroys, say, an entire city of Hiroshima full of civilians, you cannot expect that to be seen as a neutral event by the majority of the world. It is, in fact, a radicalizing event, and my book talks about that.
It seems as if war is the setting and some tragedy like this occurs, it's much harder to get people to sympathize with the victims. Instead it becomes excuse making.
Sure.
Well, that's war. These things are bound to happen. Why are you focusing on this? If it were anything else, and this is a point, I can't remember which of the 19th century anti-war voices it is, but I did an anti-war anthology for basic books with a friend of mine, and there was this one observer, and I'm going to remember it the guy as soon as I finish with you, but who was saying that if we're dealing with an earthquake or some kind of natural disaster, everybody is all tears and pity and sending donations, but people who suffer through war, it's like we don't even think of them as human. We don't treat them with any regard at all, and it has an effect that it makes us all callous, not just those of us who were on the battlefield and have to struggle with the psychological problems of having committed acts that we know to be wrong. All of us, in one way or another, get tied up in the collectivism of it, in the nationalism of it, and I'm not sure we're all prepared to acknowledge that.
I wrote some articles along those themes 2 weeks ago on the anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. We destroyed willfully an entire city full of civilians. The arguments that Hiroshima was a military target are absolutely ridiculous. That's why it wasn't bombed throughout the war. We destroyed an entire city full of people who were not combatants, and we did it purposefully. And we did it in a way using a weapon that was designed to continue killing people long after the smoke had cleared through radiation. And I wrote about this as an act of immorality. And the responses I received through my blog and through the places that carried my article, in particular the American Conservative, were horrendous. They were bloodthirsty. They were the people deserved it. I had one person explaining that it was perfectly okay to have killed all those young Japanese women because they would have gone on to bear children who might have become soldiers. This kind of vengeance, this kind of bloodthirstiness, this kind of inability to understand what it really means to kill people who are not combatants is staggering to me. And particularly when we're talking about events of 70-some years ago, that level of vengeance carried forward is terrifying to me, to know that it lives in us and that it remains a part of our character. It makes it difficult for me to understand people who don't understand how we are viewed across the world, given that the United States is currently at war in one form or another in who knows how many countries, and that when we blow up a hospital, it's inadvertent or accidental. When they blow up a hospital, they're savages. The difference between emoliating an entire city with a nuclear weapon and slaughtering someone with a knife, to me, it's a matter of scale. Some people think bigger than others.
When you traveled to Japan and talked to some elderly Japanese, was that expressly as background material for the book to help you think about it, or was
Yes.
that for something else? Okay.
No, it was part of this project. I had I worked for the State Department, and I had lived in Japan over 10 years, and then I was there several years as a student, and so I speak some Japanese, and I know my way around. And I wanted to make sure that since the book is set in World War II Japan and deals in part with a civilian there's very, very little material available in English on the civilian side of the home front, if you will, in Japan during World War II. Most of what is available is absolute garbage. You know, the idea that everyone was at home sharpening pitchforks to fight the American invaders and all that other stuff. And I needed to represent that accurately in the book. And so I was able to make contact with a range of now elderly people in Japan and to talk with them about their wartime experiences. And it was very moving because you don't oftentimes realize what it's like to sit there and say, well, now the Americans were dropping firebombs on our village, and realizing that they're talking about people, some of whom quite literally could have been my relatives, and sitting there having them explain that their village produced no war materials, that basically they were farmers, and they couldn't really see their connection to the war, but yet they were targets nonetheless. To hear suffering and to come home and try to find a way to make those characters appear real and sympathetic, not caricatures like you see in the movies. I just saw Hacksaw Ridge, the World War II movie, and but once again, the Japanese are all slant-eyed, buck-toothed guys who can't wait to kill themselves. And there were certainly members of their military that are like that, but I talked to a lot of civilians who were simply people caught up in events well beyond their comprehension. And I tried to portray those characters realistically in my book as part of adding something to history. All the stories that the Japanese characters tell are true. They are either, in most cases, information that I learned through my interviews, in some cases stuff that came out of diaries and other materials that I was able to locate. And as far as I know, there's nothing really that comprehensive that exists in English that I've run across. If somebody finds it, I'd love to have it. Send me a note. And so that's an added something to reading the book, in addition to what I hope is a pretty good war story and an anti-war warning. I think there's also some historical value in the stories themselves.
I wonder how many people would come back at you and say that cases like Nate Hooper are very much the exception, and they're tragic and everything, but if we let ourselves get distracted by these human stories, then we're going to lose our resolve to fight wars we need to fight.
Well, I mean, the answer to two-part question I'm going to make it. First, of course, is that Nate Hooper, who suffers for his life over the things that he saw and did and failed to do, there's a potential spoiler in the story, during the war, are unfortunately all too common. We're very familiar with the epidemic of veteran suicides in the United States, as well as the epidemic of veterans with alcohol problems, with drug problems. This is not a small problem in any way. It is a huge problem, the effect of being in combat. And being in the military, in serving in these situations, whether you actually were involved in taking lives or not, participating in war has a lasting effect on people, and that's nothing particularly new. But when the United States commits itself to unending war, as we have for the last 16 years, we are going to be generating people who come home with things on their mind. The second part of your question about losing our resolve to fight wars is possibly something that I'm encouraging. I think we are too quick to go to war. I think that the vast majority of fights that we do engage in are not necessary, or not necessary on the scale and way that we conduct them. And I think if we were a little more reluctant to step in and seek a military solution for all sorts of problems, we might be better off as a nation. We might do a better service to the veterans who are brave enough to stand up and volunteer, and we certainly would find ourselves with fewer enemies around the world if the most likely American that someone was going to meet is going to be wearing a uniform and carrying a weapon.
Now, Peter, you were in the State Department for a long time, and
yes.
I'm not saying this to cause you moral difficulties, but I think one of the reasons that people get so defensive when it comes to, like, if I were to criticize the milk subsidy policy of the U.S. government or whatever, just pick some random economic policy, nobody would get personally offended by that. They'd say, well, everybody has the right to be critical of the government.
Sure.
But if I'm critical of their foreign policy and of wars, well, my nephew fought in that war. How dare you speak about it? People get very defensive. And one of the reasons they get defensive is this mystique of so-called democracy, whereby we are the government. Mm-hmm. And when we start saying we did this and we launched that war and we bombed those people, it makes people feel personally invested in it, and they don't want to be told we bombed them. They want to say, well, it must have been justified if we did it.
Sure.
So that's why I want to avoid we altogether, because it implies that I had any say about this. You and I put together really had no say in any of this. So I prefer to say the government did this or they did this. But as soon as we say we, I think it obscures the proper moral calculus and it makes people defensive. Because as soon as you say we bombed them, people want to defend themselves and say, well, I guess there must have been a good reason to bomb them. Let me go look up some excuses.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And one of the reasons that Hooper's War focuses on these three people and changes the perspective is to keep forcing the reader to re-examine these people as individuals. In other words, it's not an American soldier, it's Nate Hooper. It's not the Japanese, it's these two individuals, one a soldier, a reluctant soldier, one a civilian. And by shifting the focus down to that individual level, and keeping the sweeping battle scenes, there's a few, but keeping those to a minimum and keeping the focus on the actions of individuals, I'm hoping to get around some of that we. It also is a way of reinforcing that morality exists. It scales. There are things you do as individuals. There are things we do as governments. I cannot, in any sense of the word, fault an individual soldier who, placed on the battlefield in a position to die, is handed a weapon, who uses that weapon. The individual soldiers who say, thank God for the atomic bombs, I absolutely understand and cannot fault them or criticize them in any way. The important thing is to realize that the decision to go to war is not made by those individuals. It's made by, as you pointed out, Tom, the government. And that's not a frightened 18-year-old who has to shoot or die. That is a very sober person who sits thousands and thousands of miles away, makes decisions that sends those 18-year-olds into war and brings them home in too many cases in body bags, or brings them home injured physically or psychologically, and doesn't have the responsibility of having to decide to take a life or lose his or her life. The we part actually points to the people who are truly morally responsible for this and oftentimes fully safe from the responsibilities of their immoral decisions.
Tell me about your literary decision on running the chronology of the book backwards, that he starts off as this broken man and then ends up as a boy.
The book is told in reverse chronological order. Both the age of the character starts as a 90-something-year-old man and ends as an 18-year-old. And the story starts at the end. The surprise ending, if you will, gets partially revealed very early in the book. The reason I did that is because I wanted to, and of course we know in war stories the way it's supposed to be done is the main character starts off young and innocent and ends the book or the movie as a grizzled veteran. I wanted to do it in reverse because I wanted to fully emphasize the damage that war does by bringing you backwards. I wanted to show the reader at the beginning a broken man and reconstruct him by showing you the events that broke him and end on an innocent 18-year-old who's making the choice to go off to war, so that by the end of the book, the reader is left with absence, showing what was lost because over the course of the story, we've taken that away. I think it adds a bit of bittersweetness to it. I think it humanizes the character, and I intend that it forces the reader to focus on the moral damage that's been done, because we know what's happening to this character. We know where he ends up, even though he doesn't as it's happening. I hope the reader, as these events unfold against Hooper, is screaming, don't go there, don't do it. You don't understand what's going to happen to you there, but we do. And at the end, I hope that we feel compassion for the men and women that we send off and the conditions that we often bring them home.
Well, I really do hope people will will read this book. It's hard to get people to read fiction a lot of times because I think they feel like if I'm going to take I don't know. A lot of people prefer fiction, but those of us who are nonfiction dorks sometimes feel like fiction is a guilty pleasure and indulgence. I need to learn stuff, and I only get that from nonfiction. But that's not the case at all, especially with a book like this, because you will get quite a bit of moral insight from this book.
Fiction is just the candy coating on what is a very serious story, a deeply researched story. I went to Japan and talked to elderly Japanese. I went to the Army Historical Center out in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and looked at primary documentation. I actually had a collector allow me to handle and fire an M1 World War II era M1 rifle so that I could describe that accurately. There's an extraordinary amount of nonfiction baked into a fictional story. The fiction is essentially a vehicle that allows me to tell a story in a way that I hope is engaging and interesting, but at the same time leaves you knowing a lot more about war, about what happens to men and women in war, and a lot of questions in your mind about the decision to go to war.
So I'm going to link, of course, to the book, which is Hooper's War, a novel of World War II Japan, at tomwoods.com/980. That's 980. Or you can just go directly to Amazon and type in Hooper's War and get this thing. I mean, the Kindle version is it's barely 5 smackers. Come on. I mean, help. This is, you're going to enjoy it very much. It's going to benefit you. And I believe, having read your stuff and followed you, that Peter Van Buren in general is simply worth following and reading. So thank you for doing this, and thanks again for your time today.
Tom, thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to come on the show, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
All right, that's our episode for today. Now, tonight, the president is giving an address on the future of U.S. policy in Afghanistan, and it so happens that our old friend Scott Horton has just released a book on the war in Afghanistan, so this could not be timed any better. So I am going to do my best to get Scott on here tomorrow for episode 981. We will talk about his book and his views on Afghanistan and get his commentary on whatever it is the president had to say. So that's going to be one you will not want to miss. So make sure you are subscribed to the show on iTunes or Stitcher so you get all these delightful episodes delivered to you automatically. Now, as a reward for those who listen to the end, I'm going to say, although how am I going to do this? Peter Van Buren has 2 free copies of his book, Hooper's War, available, and I think I'm going to give them away to members of my supporting listeners program. I'm just going to put a message in our private Facebook group, and then the first 2 people to respond will get those books. So if you would like to join us in there, by the way, we have lots of fun and great discussion and plenty of sanity in my private group, plus you get many other benefits as a supporting listener. So check that out at supportinglisteners.com, and we'll see you tomorrow with Scott Horton.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.